In all military conflicts throughout history until the present day, men have been required to sacrifice their lives to protect nations and ideologies. The strength of a nation is measured by how many men are under arms and ready to fight and die. If the strength of a nation was measured by how many women were willing to lay down their lives, it wouldn't remain a nation for very long. In World War I, over 20 million men died on battlefields, and another 20 million were crippled, maimed, or otherwise wounded. 0 women. In World War II, over 25 million men were killed in battle. 0 women. Vietnam, 58,190 American men, 8 women. Falklands, 255 British men, 0 women. And these men were sent to die by Margaret Thatcher, a woman. How could a woman send only men to their deaths? Could you imagine Prime Minister Gordon Brown sending exclusively women to their deaths? What would we say about the treatment of women in our society if that were true? Gulf War I, 148 dead American men, 24 dead British men, 0 women. Iraq invasion, 3,810 American men killed, 91 women. When women die in war zones, it's rarely from enemy action. It's mostly from accidents and illness. When men die, it's overwhelmingly from direct violence. But when the media speaks of females at war in Iraq, they don't mention how strange it is that although women account for 15% of all military personnel in Iraq, they account for only 2% of the casualties. When the percentages of women in the boardroom is low, women complain. When the percentages of women in parliament is low, women complain. Why are women not complaining about the percentage of women coming back dead? Millions of men were forced to fight in World War I. What were women forced to do? If a man refused to be conscripted, he was jailed. What were women jailed for? If a World War I soldier refused to follow orders, he was executed. What were women executed for? Yet women like to believe that the early 1900s was near the height of female oppression. Of the 20 million men that died on the battlefields of World War I, about 1 million British men were among them. Approximately 250,000 of the British men fighting on the Somme were 14 and 15 years old, too young for conscription, which was at 17. But these boys volunteered and were accepted by the draft sergeants, even though they knew the boys to be underage. Indeed, the youngest British boy to die in action was 14 years of age. 14-year-old girls didn't volunteer. 17-year-old girls were not conscripted. In fact, no females at all were risking their lives during these times of the woeful oppression of women. Somewhat surprisingly, considering the campaigns for women's voting rights, there's no record of women turning up at the army recruitment stations, demanding the equal right to join up. During World War II, women had 2 principal concerns: how much chocolate they were rationed, and when nylon stockings would be back in the shops.
Off with the stockings, girls. They're due for the discard, and the war effort needs them.
Men had 2 slightly different concerns: whether they'd make it through battle alive, and if they did, how many body parts would be intact. The same concerns hold true for fighting men today, but our media seems a lot more concerned with the female experience in Iraq. For example, apparently men are making life difficult for women with sexual harassment and worse. The fact that the overwhelming number of casualties are men is ignored. The fact that the presence of inadequate female soldiers endangers men is ignored. The fact that women receive the same pay as men without anything like the same risk is ignored. The fact that women officers can order men into battle without ever having faced a bullet themselves is ignored. All of this is ignored in favour of painting men as animals and women as brave flowers struggling to survive the dangers of Iraq. This woman, an advisor to government, thinks that women suffer the worst casualties in war. It's a sign of our times how women can claim absolutely anything about their supposed suffering, no matter how nonsensical, and never be called on it. In the UK, we have a volunteer army at present, but if we didn't, men would be conscripted because all nations must maintain armed forces.
Son, we live in a world that has walls, and those walls have to be guarded by men with guns. Who's gonna do it? You? You, Lieutenant Weinberg?
At 108, he's one of only 20 surviving veterans of World War I. His feelings about it are still vivid.
mixed feelings, emotional, when you see so many men are given so much. As bad as war is, anybody that's been to war, they don't want it again, but if it comes to the speech, they would do it again, if it's necessary.
So was he a gung-ho young man? Did he itch to go and fight a war and kill people and risk death? Yet he still says he'd do it again if necessary. What strength of character must you have? What nobility do you need to possess to consider doing something again that has the ability to make you cry 90 years after the event? Only men are like this. Yet for some reason, when these war dead are commemorated on Armistice Day, the words women and servicewomen are very prevalent when ministers, royalty and media speak about the sacrifice of our soldiers.
Each one representing a British or Commonwealth serviceman or woman.
And I wear a poppy in memory of servicemen and women who've lost their lives.
With memorials to 1,700,000 men and women of Britain and the Commonwealth.
British and American servicemen and women to have laid down their lives.
Meanwhile, the men that died are rarely referred to as men, but are instead soldiers, casualties, veterans and people.
I suppose this cemetery at Bayeux is one of the best known and the most visited, near the beaches where the D-Day landings took place in Normandy. 4,000 dead here.
See what is almost a generation of people buried in this one site.
We will remember them.
5.5 million British soldiers fought in the First World War. Today, only a handful remain.
It's a travesty that the word men is avoided when honouring the millions of war dead who are exclusively male. And it pisses on the graves of truly brave and noble men when women are mentioned in the same breath as men when talking of sacrifice in war. Women do die in war zones, but this occurs despite the best efforts of the military to keep them safe from harm. It's only men that are put directly in harm's way. So whilst I'm not belittling the deaths of these women, it must be acknowledged that the risks to men in combat zones are orders of magnitude greater, and the numbers of men killed are orders of magnitude greater. When Prince Charles told the story of bravery and sacrifice in the war, he passes over any mention of the myriad ways in which 25 million men met their deaths, and instead chooses to focus on how a few women were killed.
I wish to say that the conduct of all the girls was most courageous. They all knew what was going to happen to them, but no one panicked. They just marched ahead with their chins up.
These same people will not say men and women when speaking about domestic violence or child abuse, for example, where statistics are at least even. But when female war dead amounts to approximately 0% of all war dead, commentators go out of their way to speak of brave women.
Thousands of servicemen and women are still being sent
to save the men and women who are out there fighting a war that is about capitalism.
I dispute the mention of women in these broadcasts. Women have not proven themselves brave. Women in the military cannot be compared to men.
There's no need for that, sir. If your boys don't get that chopper in 4 hours, our boys go in and blow it away.
Our boys, Captain, include women, one of whom has already given her life on this mission.
I'm sorry, ma'am. It's just a figure of speech.
Eagle Patrol at
But it's the pattern of female behaviour to want recognition for very little. Women want to claim equality with men in the discussion of death in war, whilst leaving the actual dying almost exclusively to men.
This is the only Second World War cemetery here in England. In this cemetery we have 3,812 that are buried, and on the wall of missing, which is right behind me, we have 5,126 names on the wall of missing. Majority of the that are buried here were actually stationed here in England and flying missions to the continent area, and we do have infantry that are also buried here, but they were here mainly from casualties, mainly from being interned at the hospitals here and probably died while they were being treated for wounds.
Could you give an idea of the proportions of men and women that are buried here, the servicemen and women, or what are the numbers?
Well, the women that are buried here are 13, and the rest are all, they're connected with the Red Cross.
So how would the Red Cross have died during this period?
Accidents mostly, and in relationship to the war, I would say mostly by accidents.
In the UK, every November, Britain's war dead are remembered. The primary purpose of this day is to remember the dead men of World War I, the most awful of the world wars as regards the cheapness of men's lives. Men were ordered out of their trenches and made to walk slowly towards the enemy under machine gun fire and artillery bombardment. In one day, during one battle, Britain lost 58,000 men, as many men as America lost in the entire Vietnam War. Millions of men faced poison gas, landmines, and -20-degree temperatures on the battlefronts at Verdun and the Somme. Millions of men died or were horribly mutilated and crippled. Millions of men were willing volunteers, and millions more were conscripts, sent to fight and die in conditions so awful that they simply defy belief. Thousands of men lost their sanity or were shell-shocked into coma, and hundreds of men were executed for simply being unable to function as soldiers in a literal hell on earth. World War I was quite simply the worst war in imagining. It has the distinction of being quite probably the most awful experience human beings have ever suffered through, and although it is never ever highlighted, it was exclusively men that had to live through it and die through it. The cenotaph was unveiled in 1920 to commemorate the sacrifice of these men. It has nothing whatsoever to do with women, because they were not present on battlefields then, and they're frankly not present on battlefields now. In 2004, a memorial was unveiled to animals who served in World War II, and in 2005, a new war memorial was created.
And behind it, a new memorial this year, just a few hundred yards up from the cenotaph itself. It's a memorial to the women of World War II, the millions of women who supported the war effort, whether working as nurses, driving ambulances, working in munitions factories.
This memorial to women, of course, fails to acknowledge the efforts of men on the home front during the war. Men who were too old, too sick, or else injured from battle, or still recovering from the First World War. These men who were the driving force behind the industry and technology in Britain, supporting the men fighting in battle. From code breaking at Bletchley Park to tank shell production in Birmingham, men were still the main workhorses. Undoubtedly, women were fantastic on the home front during the war, but men were simply more so. In the light of men's contribution to the war effort, both at home and on the fronts, I don't know why these new statues exist. If we now have memorials to dogs, donkeys and women, what does a cenotaph mean? I think that what's happening is a deliberate attempt to belittle the enormous sacrifice of men in war. By unveiling statues for animals and women, and perhaps in future a statue to remember all of the windows that were broken during the war, male sacrifice is diluted, as if men, women and animals all sacrifice to the same degree. Well, with all due respect to women and animals, as much as you suffered and as much as you helped, it's men, and men alone, who deserve eternal recognition. A job in the army is a great career for a woman. There's next to no chance of ever being put in harm's way, yet they receive the same pay, benefits and career prospects as men. An army job even comes with free childcare and free breast implants.
I've always wanted breast implants, even when I was in the army. I tried to get them out of the army as well, and they won't give me them because they said that my boobs are fine.
Of course, the media would have it that women bear at least as much danger as men, if not more.
Can we get this patient Jesus, please? Shine a light in your eye. Go, go, go. 10 mil single dose.
What's a minor injury? A lot of times you hear on the news there's some minor injuries. What's a minor injury in a battle?
You have your triage,
yeah.
And then depends on the severity. If you've got someone that could be, he's got an injury, but if you tend to that wound, he could be another man back out. He could be another number out there fighting. He'll be catered to first than someone who's no uncertain terms of write-off. If that person is more than likely going to die, or it's going to take out two men to try and get them sorted, whereas this bloke could be back on his feet. If he's tended to now, you're going to get this guy out there, you're going to sacrifice that one. The way it works. an injury would be a gunshot wound to the shoulder, something like that, maybe arm, so not major organs.
For the next 2 hours, Sam will be guarding the camp from inside a vulnerable sentry post. She's a prime target for snipers.
It's a sad fact that for all the talk of brave men and women, and the sacrifice of men and women, and the commitment of men and women in the armed forces, it's only the men that come back in body bags.
In the army, women are not put in the front line, but they expect to be paid the same. I mean, I think that's outrageous. Women in the military were allowed to do pretty much what they liked, and that no male officer dared to, in any way, exert his authority over them, and the reason we ought to admonish them for things that they might have done wrong, because they were fearful of sexual harassment suits.
Women are a liability in the military for numerous reasons. Women cannot perform as well as men in battle. They're weaker, slower, smaller, and lack the temperament for the stress of battlefield action.
What's wrong? Come on, get up, let's go! Come on, we haven't got time for this!
They can't carry sufficient equipment, they lack the endurance of men, and they're plain inferior as soldiers. An average 13-year-old boy is more physically suited to soldiering than even an above-average woman. Women are allowed into the military without reaching even broadly similar standards as men. For example, they're allowed to do push-ups on their knees.
It's just the way it is, so they have to cater for that within the forces as well. Press-ups, they're not expected to do as many press-ups as us. And they have women press-ups where they don't keep their whole body off the ground. They put their knees on the ground and do press-ups that way. One in 5 guys that actually aspires to be a Marine won't actually get into the basic to do it, to actually get on the course to do it. The guy that actually churns out the other end, for the Marines, you'll probably have 1 out of 10 guys who actually make the 36 weeks that they do.
Women in the military increases the risk to male soldiers because men tend to protect the females, and their presence means that there are also fewer men to do the dangerous work.
In the military, where it's not just a question of even if you just said, well, let's choose the strongest and the most intelligent people to join, and women made the cut and could lift all the things up, and even under those circumstances, the presence of women in kind of frontline combat troops can be sort of disruptive or kind of upset the cohesiveness of the weird psychology that men get into when they're in life or death combat.
If you have a mixed group, men and women, in a combat situation, that there is going to be a tendency for that old protective role to come back in, and that the men will be more protective of the women.
I mean, just kind of in an intuitive sense, instead of all of a sudden it moves from being this team against that team to being all these individuals versus these other individuals for the attentions of this woman, or you find that the soldiers in this unit are suddenly taking more risks on behalf of, they're sort of being more chivalrous, for example, they're taking more risks on behalf of one of the members of their squad than they would do for others. It detracts from them being sort of an efficient fighting machine. I certainly don't think the argument is well, just men are just saying it. I don't think men necessarily want to kind of keep life-threatening violence to themselves. I mean,
women generally lack the ability to throw hand grenades far enough to avoid causing damage to their own forces. But instead of this precluding women from soldiering, the army built safety shields so that women could complete their training. The army did this for 2 reasons. 1, because of the enormous pressure to include women in the military, and 2, because it doesn't matter whether a woman can throw a grenade far enough or not. She'll never be in harm's way, so it's irrelevant if she can throw a grenade safely. A man who's smaller or weaker than average gets no quarter.
Is that a requirement a fixed standard? Doesn't matter how big you are, what size you are,
doesn't
what
matter.
weight you are.
Doesn't matter how great you are, everything else. If you can't swim or if you can't do that physical test, then gone.
So would some of the physical tests be like carrying a certain weight across a certain distance?
Yeah.
That weight is the same no matter who the person is?
Yeah, exactly. No matter who the person is.
I would say a guy would be better than a woman, say in the SAS, purely because of his physical advantages, his whole being, of a guy, his aggression, his testosterone. and his drive. And again, it would work the other way. I don't think guys would, you know, be as good as a woman cleaning a house. No, I'm only joking. Well, no, I'm only joking.
Women have numerous means at their disposal to prevent pregnancy, and so behaviour like this is equivalent to desertion and should be treated as such. Needless to say, there was no equivalent punishment for women watching men urinate. Women in reserve units that have children are supposed to have an immediate action plan to have their children cared for if they're called up for duty. So these women get the pay and benefits of an army reserve job, but can easily escape the call up to fight. They can't be punished for the dereliction of duty as men would be, because to do so would be considered discrimination. So women have done very little indeed in comparison with men as regards sacrifice in war. But what women have done, however, I think can only be described as despicable.
I thought it was going to be such fun too, we all did. Joining the local regiment and everything. It was great, I'll never forget it. It was the first time I ever felt really popular. Everyone was cheering, throwing flowers. Some girl even come up and kissed me.
Women have sent men off to die with kisses and hugs for centuries.
Come on, lovey. Don't take on now.
I'm all right. Kids are going to miss you.
And women expect men to do so without fear or complaint, or else they're cowards.
And since you are of draft age and a United States citizen and for some mysterious reason refuse to go back to your own country...
There ain't nothing mysterious about my reasons.
Like how you got so black on the outside when you're so yellow on the inside?
In British history, to be given a white feather was to be accused of cowardice.
Give it to me.
And you are a coward.
For women to dare to ever accuse men of cowardice is both ridiculous and evil. Yet such an accusation is typical of women in our society, cosseted, protected and put on a pedestal. Women have no clue of what it is to be a man with its attendant pressures and obligations. The reality is that under our common definitions of cowardice, running away at the first sign of danger, requiring others to put their lives at risk to save yours, screaming and begging for mercy, heading for the lifeboats first, not signing up for war, then the world's greatest cowards are women. The treatment of men and the use of men in history cannot fail but to offer up a low self-image of man to himself. From birth, in all quarters, we teach our sons that they're relatively worthless death objects. They're unpaid bodyguards to women.
Hey! Why don't you leave her alone? Oh,
They must be brave and willing to sacrifice their lives for women or vague government ideology, or else they're cowards.
I said, what's wrong, Travers? I'm afraid to face those guns, sir. I said, would you rather face me? He took one look at my face and off he went. 10 minutes later, he was shot to pieces at the head of his men. As a soldier should be, eh?
I quite agree with you, General. I can tolerate nerves before a battle, but I can't stand cowardice.
November 25th is International Anti-Violence Against Women Day. But the greatest human rights scandal of our times is not the abuse of women in whatever form it may take. Rather, it's a question of why it is that the abuse of women is the only abuse we're concerned about. Men are much more often the real victims of violence in times of peace, and are almost exclusively victims in times of war. The violence against men, through all of history and to the present day, is greater than most women can conceive. Yet there is no Anti-Violence Against Men Day. There's no doubt that women suffer grave injustices throughout the world, and have suffered throughout our history. But the overriding truth that seems to be ignored is that for every abuse against women, anywhere in the world and at any time in history, the abuses suffered by men are orders of magnitude worse.
The report claims that Arab militia are kidnapping and gang-raping women.
The vast majority of news reports covering Iraq, Afghanistan, or problems in Africa focus on women and children. Men are pointedly ignored, except as objects of blame.
This tragedy is man-made.
At the roadside, we saw women and children. They're being forced to flee.
Hundreds of thousands, mostly women and children, are living in camps with little food and clean water.
It's mostly women and children endlessly depicted on our screens, because the suffering of men is mostly out of sight and out of mind. Where the women have been spared to speak of their terrible experience, the men were simply executed. One hateful idea I've come across from women is that men start wars, and so men deserve to die in them. As if conflict only exists because of the nature of men. But men do not like war, and nor do they seek it.
And my existence, while grotesque and incomprehensible to you, saves lives. You don't want the truth because deep down in places you don't talk about at parties, you want me on that wall. You need me on that wall.
So you'd say you did not join up to shoot people?
No.
What do you say to someone that says anyone that joins the Marines or the Army just wants to shoot people and go and fight a war somewhere?
They're snags.
What is snag?
If they want to join up for that one sole purpose, then they might as well be a terrorist themselves. You know.
So, do you think that's an ignorant thing for people to say?
Yeah. If you did get a majority of people saying that, only a handful would actually mean it. It's what the forces gives you. It sets you up for outside life as well. You know, it's like loads of countries do their national service. They do 2 years, and they'll take people that are down and out, so have got no ambition or drive in their life. They have nowhere to go. They don't know what they're doing. But they'll take them to a 2-year military training. They do their 2 years, and then bang, they come out the other end, and they're more disciplined. They know what they're capable of doing. They know the limits. And they come out better men at the end of it. People join up to want to serve their country. People join up because it offers a load of careers, You get to travel a hell of a lot. There's a range of ways, of means of joining up, and then you've got the rough for the smooth. If you go to war, you go to war. You don't wish on it. You might wish for a bit of action if you're in a boring job. But then when you're actually in a war scenario, the last place you want to be is there.
Blaming men for the very existence of violence, as women are happy to do, once again shows how worthless the lives of men are viewed, and the privileged position of women in our society. And women are the most excessive consumers on the planet. From clothing to makeup, from shoes to jewellery, from 4x4 cars to beauty parlours, women are voracious consumers of the world's luxuries and resources. And most wars are fought over natural resources. Yet women have never had to do the fighting for survival, or fight for the meal on their table, or the roofs over their heads. They've left men to do that dirty work, and then seek to blame men for doing it.
I have neither the time nor the inclination to explain myself to a man who rises and sleeps under the blanket of the very freedom that I provide, and then questions the manner in which I provide it. I would rather you just said thank you and went on your way. Otherwise, I suggest you pick up a weapon and stand a post.
Women have consistently claimed that conflict arises out of the nature of men, and this despicable idea is meant to shame and belittle the sacrifices that men continually make for family, community and country. But women are very well aware that this isn't true, and that men have done what's necessary because, as in all things, men are the best equipped to do so, not because men seek conflict.
At the end of the day, I think women, if they were trying to get a certain outcome, would be left with the same choices as men.
It is in human nature to compete. If there is a prize, people will compete for it.
When we examine the high prevalence of black-on-black violence, we ask, what is it about their situation that causes this? We don't dare to say, well, it's just blacks killing blacks, so they deserve it. Why are men not extended the same understanding?
As from Friday, I don't call them gunmen no more. They're terrorists, and they should be treated accordingly as terrorists. Females and mothers and babies and children being shot is terrorism.
Then presumably she thinks that fathers and other men being shot is not a problem. Why don't men ever qualify for protection? There are several wars that are fought over the diamond trade. But how many men do you know that give a fuck about diamonds? Except when it's time to buy one for a woman.
I will feel it low just thinking.
Whatever you choose, you'll get it so right.
Women make themselves feel better about the blood on their hands by telling themselves that diamonds are good if they're not conflict diamonds.
Diamonds are a girl's best friend. Diamonds are mined by people in Africa who are practically slaves.
Absolutely beautiful, Laurie. Scott, it's beautiful.
It's blood-free, too. It costs extra, but Scotty wanted to be assured that no Africans lost any limbs for this.
Who do you think buys the stones that I bring out? Dreamy American girls who all want a storybook wedding and a big shiny rock.
The selfishness, greed and vanity of women is the prime cause of the deaths of these men. Unfortunately, men cater to this female flaw in the hope that women will love them for it.